picking up where we left off on Wednesday, we'll just kind of back up and run through them real quickly. So we talked about just an overview of what we're going to talk about this semester. We talked about the terminology that we're going to use, or not this semester, but this section. And everything that we're doing in this section is about scatter cleanup. So the things that we talked about in chapter 13, chapter 10 apply. Really the practical application and how to fix those problems in this chapter. We talked a little bit about what we talked about in chapter 7 and 8 and the different types of interactions and the different things that affect the brim spectrum and peak energy and average energy, which certainly can affect our grayscale through scatter radiation, which is again what we're talking about in this section. We talked about the technical factors specifically and how they affect the image and scatter radiation specifically again. And really, for the most part, your kVp is the only thing that you routinely use. This is going to be crazy. The thing that you routinely use to affect a change in energy, which in turn affects your scatter radiation. Right? Filtration, voltage, waveform, both do as well, but you just don't, when's the last time you selected single phase versus three phase on your machine? Never. You can't do it, right? You gotta have two different types of machines. And filtration, you just don't change filtration that much. So we talked about the primary beam versus the remnant beam. And the primary beam being that from the focus. We talked about what off-focus radiation is and what it does, and that's really affect the sharpness, recorded detail. And what we're doing in this section specifically is visibility and scatter cleanup and scatter control. So we talked about the remnant beam and what that is. It's coming through the patient, so it's post-patient. That's what gives us our image. It's the image-forming X-rays, and that's the image is composed of contrast and density. And what the remnant beam is a very small fraction of the primary beam. So even at very high kVp, most of what's created is going to be absorbed inside of the patient. In part because you think about the brim spectrum, your average beam energy is 1/3 of the maximum. So at 80 kVp, it's, what would that be, 20-something kVp is your average beam energy. So most of that's going to be absorbed inside of the patient. So then we talked about the review of sharpness, recorded detail versus visibility. Visibility is really your contrast and your density and how we maximize your contrast and optimize your density, and everything else is basically geometric factors. So we talked about motion being the most significant. We talked about image receptor issues a little bit, and we'll talk about that more later in the curriculum. We won't get to it this semester, but we'll get to it later in the curriculum. Focal spot size being what you use on the machine to affect a change in sharpness or recorded detail, but certainly OID and SID play a portion in that, as well as angulation. So we talked about the effects on scatter, of scatter on density, and on contrast, and we talked about what a high contrast versus low contrast image look like, and we took a look at a couple of those. So we talked about the effects of scatter radiation on detail, and we said it doesn't affect detail. Detail being your actual sharpness, that is your resolution. So really it's just a visibility factor. So it's a visibility or recorded detail and not a sharpness issue. And then we looked at those two, where we have this milky looking real gray appearance. We've got presence of fog, just like fog, we use the analogy of driving to school and being able to see the landscape real well on a clear day versus a foggy day. On a clear day, we can see those trees real well. And on a foggy day, we can't see them all that well, even though they're still there, right? So sharpness or recorded detail is present on both of those, but the visibility is less on the foggy image. On a foggy day, trees are still there, you just can't see them quite as well. So how we deal with scatter radiation and the effects of fog on the image is to either prevent it from being created or clean it up after it is created. So we're going to create scatter, we're going to create fog. There's nothing we can really do about that. Even in dense tissues, we create a lot of scatter radiation. We're going to have more scatter radiation than what we're going to have true penetration without interaction. But we can do things to maximize how much is going through the patient in the form of scatter. So kVp is one, field size is another. We can deal with patient thickness minimally. You know, a big patient's going to be a big patient, and we can't do a whole lot about that, right? We can do a little bit about it. We seldom do, but we can do a little bit about it. And then after it's created, we've got grids that clean up scatter radiation. That's the whole purpose for a grid, is to remove the scatter or prevent the scatter from hitting the image receptor. So we remove it from the remnant beam before it strikes the image receptor. So either prevent it from being created with certain kVps, and certainly with manipulation of field size, possibly do something with patient thickness if at all possible, but then afterwards we're going to deal with scatter radiation through absorption in a grid. So remembering that we've got really 4 different types of interactions, 2 of which are scatter radiation. One is Thompson, and we just don't talk about Thompson a whole lot. That's narrow angle scatter radiation. It goes through the patient, it comes out of the patient, but it almost completely parallels transmission, being transmission without any kind of interaction. Remember, you got 2 different types of transmission. Transmission just means it goes all the way through the patient. So if we have interaction inside of the patient and it projects away from the image receptor, is that transmission? Well, it is transmission, but not in the context that we generally think of transmission. So it transmits through the patient, but it's not transmission without any kind of interaction. Okay, so generally when I say transmission, that's what I'm talking about, is transmission without any kind of interaction. It misses everything. It goes straight through the patient. Okay, those hit the image receptor. The scatter radiation, the Thompson, if it exits the patient, it's also going to hit the image receptor. And it's going to put a layer of fog down, but 2 things about Thompson. One is it's very low energy, and it parallels well, 3 things really. It parallels the transmission almost exactly, so it's pretty much inseparable from the transmission. All right, so those 2, plus it accounts for a very small portion of the remnant beam. So we don't talk about it a whole lot because it's almost indistinguishable except for energy level from transmission, okay? So it almost doesn't matter. It does mess up the image just a little bit because it's only a very small portion of the remnant beam, but what really messes up the image significantly is your Compton. So you got Thompson. Thompson is also referred to as classical scattering. And that's what all that was. So that's one. Then we've got transmission. It goes through it. It doesn't touch anything. We've got photoelectric absorption, which those account for, that absorption accounts for the light areas on the image. So you have a photon that enters the patient and it hits something and it can't penetrate through that something, and it deposits all of its energy inside of the patient. That's where most of the patients, their radiation exposure comes from, is through photoelectric absorption. Now, we tend to think of photoelectric absorption as being a single event, right? The photon enters the patient, it hits them, and it absorbs, and that's it. That's the end of it. But in reality, what can happen is a single photon can enter the patient's body, and it can bounce around off of a few different atoms before it becomes a photoelectric event. So in that bouncing around, you may have some things going on there as well. Okay, so if it knocks out an inner shell electron from a one of your atoms, or one of your patient's atoms inside of the patient. It knocks out that inner shell electron. Is that a normal condition for that atom to be in? Just like in the target, no, it's not. It's not a normal condition, so it ejected that electron. So what's it going to do? It's going to replace it. It's going to grab an electron from somewhere else. Okay, so first off, think about that. You got an X-ray photon, enters the patient's body, hits something, knocks out an electron, replaces that electron, grabs it from somewhere else. Does that sound like a good thing to be going on inside of the patient's body? No, it doesn't. So what else is going to happen is that as it grabs an electron from somewhere else, either another shell or a free-floating electron that got knocked out from a different atom, guess what's going to happen? What happens in the target? What kind of interaction does that sound like? Characteristic, yeah. So the patient becomes an X-ray emitter. So a single X-ray photon that enters the patient ionizes a number of different atoms. The patient can then create X-rays. Those X-rays may emit from the patient. So a single X-ray photon can create a lot of scatter radiation. Okay? So what if you're shooting, well, I'm getting a little deep for this slide yet, but what if you set your kVp at a very high kVp? What do you know about kVp, high kVp? What does it do? It penetrates, right. So it penetrates, but does it necessarily penetrate all the way through the patient? No. But it's going to penetrate deeper into the patient before it becomes a photoelectric, right? So at higher kVp, what are you creating more of inside of the patient if it doesn't just hit something and stop? A lot of scatter. So you start to see why it is that high kVp gives you more scatter radiation, right? Because you can undergo a number of these ionizing events, and that one scattered X-ray photon may exit the patient and hit the image receptor, but all those atoms that it ionized on its way through can also emit X-rays that also hit the image receptor, okay? So high kVp is not just the single photon with the high kVp that strikes the image receptor, but it's creating X-rays inside of the patient that also exit the patient and create fog as well, okay? So the only thing that we have left, let's see, well, we've kind of covered the photoelectric interaction, but we've got the Thompson, the Compton, is what we're just now describing. And the thing about the Compton is, and this diagram is a little simplistic in that it's just showing that photon scattered off, okay? So Thompson parallels the transmission, right? So what we're looking at here in all of these, both of these, is transmission of a Compton atom, or a Compton photon, right? So even though this one doesn't scatter off at a very steep angle, it's still a steeper angle than the straight transmission, right? So the patient's dose comes from both the absorption, the partial absorption of that photon, but also significantly from the total absorption of the photon. Now where does your dose come from? The Compton, right. You're standing right here. There's your stick figure. You're going to get hit by that, right? So, you know, what are your rules for your personal radiation protection? Where do you stand? 6 feet away, right? 6 feet away and at 90 degrees, right? So, does that guarantee that you're not going to get hit by any radiation? The answer is no, it doesn't. I may have related this story last semester, but it's worth repeating. Used to work in a hospital, and we had in the emergency room, which was detached from the X-ray department, kind of like Mother Francis. You know, the X-ray department's in one area, and the ER is kind of away from it. This hospital was the same way. And it had 2 X-ray rooms side by side, and we were still using film, so it had a dark room right in the middle, okay? And if the patient was a trauma patient, obviously we were doing it in a trauma room, but if the patient was, could come to the department, even if they were on the backboard, we'd wheel them down to the department and get better images. So the setup of the room was such that we had to shoot. The dark room was well shielded, so it didn't get a whole lot of scatter radiation inside of it, but we had to shoot directly towards the dark room. All right, so this represents the wall. I got a table here and I got a table over there. Okay, so dark room is here, table over here, table over there. Straight up this wall, on the inside of the x-ray room, what you had was a control panel. Okay, so we're shooting cross table laterals, and if the control panel were to be represented by this IV pole here, right? I'm standing, get this over here so you can have it later. I'm standing here behind the control panel, and there's a partial wall that comes right here. Control panel is right over here, okay? And a patient's laying on a backboard, and we're doing a cross table lateral L-spine on the patient, and this is 10 feet, right? Is that 90 degrees from the patient? If the x-ray beam is coming into the patient from your eye perspective, is that 90 degrees? I'm at 90 degrees plus 10 feet, right? Should be good if I'm wearing an apron, right? Well, we also, in that same room, had a wall bucky, on the exit door. So the door, the wall bucky is here, right? Wall bucky is here. And there was a guy, we're shooting chest x-ray on this patient. I shot the PA, and he's standing outside the room, so he's got that radiation protection here, right, in the wall. He's standing outside the room. He's also about 6 feet away, a little steeper than 90 degrees, but he should be okay because you got all that barrier, right? So he's standing outside the room. I shoot the PA, hand him the film. I shoot the lateral, and he goes into the dark room and develops both of them. So he's holding the PA in his arm, in his hand, like you would carry a textbook, right? So he's holding it like this. So shoot the lateral, and he goes in and develops it. And whenever we take a look at the PA and the lateral both, we can make a diagnosis of fracture on his arm off of that x-ray because you can see from the scatter radiation his bones in his arm. So it got us thinking, okay, that was about 6 feet, and it was steeper than 90 degrees. Let's mock up a patient. It's going to move down right there. Let's mock up a patient. Take some water bottles. Let's shoot through just something that would create some x-rays, some scatter. Now let's see how much of an exposure we're getting behind the control panel. 10 feet away, 90 degrees. Also, there was a hallway that went from one of the rooms to the other, in between. A little bathroom back there. So we took a film, we shot just directly into the wall with a lateral L-spine technique, took a film and just kind of held it out from in between these rooms, right? Just to see how much scatter radiation we got from behind the control panel, and it was significant. Again, you could see the bones in your finger, and that was 10 feet away, 90 degrees. Okay, so I went a long ways to say, your dose comes off of this, right? You're going through, radiobiology right now, and the general rule is 6 feet and 10 feet, or 6 feet and 90 degrees, right? But is that enough? And the answer is no, it's not. 10 feet and 90 degrees wasn't nearly enough, right? So what are your other possible means of radiation protection? 3 of them. Times, distance, shielding, right? So what all can you use and apply that to? Do you sometimes have to be in a room with a patient when you make an exposure? Do you always have to? No. So that's number one, is get out of the room when you can. If you cannot, what's your next thing? That was time. So distance. So what are you going to do? Is there a time you have to be right there with the patient? Absolutely. Sometimes, you know, if you're doing, say, cross-table lateral hip, somebody's got to hold a leg up on a trauma patient, right? So there are times you're going to take a pretty good blast, right? But when you don't have to be right next to the patient, what are you going to do? Step away from the patient, right? And then shielding, what are you going to do? First off is wear your lead, right? But secondly, get behind a barrier if you can, right? From that point on, when we were making those cross-table lateral L-spines and we were shooting directly into that wall, do you think we stood right there behind the control panel? No, we went in the bathroom, right? We went around the corner into that hallway as far away as we could. Okay, so time distance shielding, use it. Your dose is coming off of this thing, right? So when that enters your body, and it's kind of like secondhand smoke, it's going to be a lower energy, right? The patient filtered out some of that energy, but what's going to be happening inside of you? All of that, right? Including you becoming an X-ray emitter and an X-ray creator. Okay? So I know that was a little bit preachy, but you know, make sure that you know, protect yourself in clinicals. I see way too many people, usually not students, it's usually techs that you've worked with for a long time, and they go and position a patient for a portable chest X-ray, and you know, this is a very skinny patient, but they position a patient for a portable chest X-ray, and for whatever reason, they feel like they've got to have their hand on the image receptor when they make an exposure. Any of y'all worked with this person? Good. Hopefully, you know, they're starting to retire, but some of these older techs feel like they've got to have their hand on the image receptor. They just get blasted with scatter. Okay? So, you know, make sure you follow your time distance shielding and get away from Compton when you can. So, written version of everything that we just talked about. Classical scattering may parallel transmitted photons. It's Thomson scattering. It's not as important as other interactions, so we don't really talk about it a whole lot. That says no loss of energy, but there is a significant loss of energy. And it, you know, they tend to be low energy is what that should read. So photoelectric interaction, that's the highest contributor to patient dose because all of the energy is absorbed inside of the patient. The photon bounces around inside of the patient, and then it is eventually absorbed. So your patient dose goes up whenever the photon loses all of its energy inside of the patient. It's not the act of exiting the patient, but it's the act of the patient absorbing all of that energy. That patient dose goes up. So Compton interaction, the patient does get some, but this is your highest contributor. This is your highest dose comes off of Comptons. You shouldn't be hit by classical scattering because classical scattering should parallel transmission, which means the only time you're going to get hit with that is if you're standing in primary beam or you're standing between the patient and the image receptor, right? Same thing with the transmission. Transmission just provides density. Compton provides density, but also fog. Classical scattering provides some degree of fog, not as much as Compton, and photoelectric gives you those light areas. Negative densities, positive densities. Okay, so just more of the same stuff, and more of the same stuff. All right. So factors that affect scatter production. Remember, we've got scatter production, and we've got scatter, so we've got creation, and then we've got scatter cleanup. So the things that affect the creation of scatter would be your kVp, your field size, and your patient factors. That'd be in patient thickness, which is usually soft tissue whenever we're talking about changes in patient thickness, and tissue type. All right, so kVp, how do changes in, what we're going to ask and answer is how do changes in kVp affect X-ray production? How do changes in kVp affect penetration, which we've already talked about? How do changes in kVp affect patient dose? Well, really, we've kind of talked about all of this. What kind of techniques are better for patient dose? You should know that from previous chapters. Can anything compensate for a lack of penetration? Be a mass or computer processing, and how do changes in kVp affect occupational dose? So, how do changes in penetration affect scatter? How does scatter affect contrast and latitude? How does scatter affect density? And what about patient size increases? What about tissue composition changes? And some examples there. And what do those changes do to patient dose? All right, so again, Compton scatter is what your dose is composed of. Not all Compton scatter is going to be a dose to you, but that is where your dose comes from, right? Some of the Compton scatter will affect the image, and that's what we have to deal with in scatter cleanup. Okay, so notice your kVp at low kVp, what you have is a very high photoelectric interaction, okay? So your total interaction is 99%, but you get 79% of the interaction is photoelectric and roughly 21% is Compton. All right, so that's not to say that some of that Compton or some of that photoelectric doesn't start off as Compton. It might, but you get less than 1% total transmission. Okay? At 60 kVp, notice your photoelectric drops. At 70, it drops more. At 80, it drops more. And then at 120, it drops all the way down to 18%. Okay? Your Compton, on the other hand, goes in the opposite direction. At low kVp, your Compton is relatively low, and at high kVp, it's very high. Okay? So total interactions drop, and your total transmission increases as kVp goes up. So that's total transmission of both Compton and true transmission as well. All right, so as kVp goes up on your BREM spectrum, the peak of your BREM spectrum goes up, you get an increase in numbers. That's an increase in numbers emitted from the tube housing and the collimator housing, providing you don't do anything else, right? If you increase your kVp and you decrease your mass, though, then what you get is a change in primarily, you're going to get a reduction in what you create, but what is penetrated through the patient remains the same. All right. So if we're just changing kVp, we get an increase in what's emitted, and we get an increase in what's penetrated through the patient as well. So you remember back to the last section, we talked about what happens if you increase your kVp and you don't do anything with mass. What happens to your patient dose? It goes up dramatically, right? 15% change in kVp gives you roughly what kind of a change on the image receptor? A double in exposure to the image receptor. Is your patient dose going to double as well? Who says yes? Who says, okay, we got one yes. Who says no?
You said only if you increase kVp?
If you only increase kVp, does your patient dose go up as well?
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Well, does it double though?
I don't know.
It's a tricky thing to think about. And the answer is no. It does not double your patient dose. It does increase your patient dose dramatically. But remember, as kVp goes up, what do you get? Increase in what's penetrated, right? So if you increase your kVp by 15%, what are you going to have more of? You're going to have more Compton, but you're also going to have more.
Scatter.
That's your Compton. You're going to have more penetration, right? So what you're going to have is a higher percentage of those photons penetrate through the patient. They don't deposit all of their energy inside of the patient, okay? So your patient goes up and it goes up dramatically, but it doesn't quite go up by a factor of 2. Now, if you increase your mass by a factor of 2, then your dose goes up exactly by a factor of 2. Okay? But since kVp, if we increased our kVp, we increase the percentage penetrated, then our dose goes up, but it doesn't go up exactly by a factor of 2. All right, so as kVp increases, energy increases, frequency increases, and wavelength decreases. You remember frequency and wavelength from last semester. They're inversely proportional, and frequency is directly proportional to energy. All right, so as kVp increases, a percentage of Comptons increase. So the percentage of PEs decrease, and we get an increase in transmission. Okay, so as kVp increases, PEs decrease, and that is the largest contributor to patient dose. So when we increase our kVp by 15%, or we reduce our mass by a factor of 2, now we can reduce the patient dose, right? Because of all of that, as kVp increases, you get a higher percentage of what penetrates through the patient. And remembering that photoelectrics don't penetrate through the patient, and they also give you the highest contributor to patient dose. So if we increase our kVp and reduce our mass, then a higher percentage of the photons that we create are going to penetrate through the patient, not deposit all that energy inside of the patient, and as a result, the patient dose goes down. Okay? So cutting the mass in half all by itself reduces the patient dose by a factor of 2, right? But if we increase our kVp by 15% and reduce our mass by a factor of 2, does that mean that our patient dose is going to go down by a factor of 2? No, it's not. Because you increased your kVp, right? You increase your kVp all by itself, and what happens to dose? Goes up, right? You reduce your mass by a factor of 2, and what happens to patient dose? It goes down. It doesn't come down to the same amount, it comes down to lower than what it would have been with lower kVp and higher mass, but it's not a reduction by a factor of 2. Okay, so your patient dose goes down with higher kVp, lower mass techniques. But what happens to your dose if you're standing closer to the patient? You increase kVp, lower mass, what happens to your dose? It goes up. Why? Create more scatter, right? You create more scatter radiation, your dose is going to go up. So, you're shooting portable chest x-rays. What kind of techniques, kVp, are you using on portable chest? No. Anybody using 100 kVp? I've worked in hospitals, kind of played with that, and on film it just made a great mess. But I again worked in hospitals, did it. But 100, 110 kVp on a portable chest X-ray, you're going to create a whole lot more scatter radiation than at using 80, 90 kVp. Yeah. So you create more scatter radiation. So if you find yourself working in a hospital where you use 100, 110 kVp on portable chest X-rays, what are your options? You don't have leaded walls in a patient's room. Portable? Yeah, portable. Stand behind the portable, right. So, next time you're at clinicals, turn your portable off and try to push it. Okay, you're going to find two things. One is it's motor driven, and with the motor disengaged, or the motor not working, I won't say disengaged, but if it's not working, if it's not energized, it's hard to push. Okay, but most of your machines will have a way to disengage the motor. Okay, like the old GE portables, there was a little button right up under the handle you could push just in case your portable died, but you had to push it somewhere. So if you push that, it disengaged the motor and you could push it a whole lot easier. And it was still hard to push. Okay, it's like pushing a car. You ever been standing on the elevator when somebody comes on with a portable? What does it do? Right. And that is because most of your portables, unless you happen to be working with one that you plug in every time you use, it carries its own electric supply. So again, thinking back to last semester, how do you get a portable electric supply? Batteries, right. Ever picked up a car battery? They ain't light, you know. They're in a box about, you know, that big. And the whole thing probably weighs about, just that box probably weighs 60 pounds minimum. It's full of fluid and it's full of lead, right? So what do x-rays not go through well? Lead, metal, right? So if this thing is full of lead, keeping in mind that x-rays don't bend like light does. It travels in a straight line, right? Until it hits something, then it redirects. So you stand behind that portable, right? And you're watching your patient, and you know the patient can cooperate. You know, if you got an uncooperative patient, you might not be able to do this, but if the patient can cooperate and you say, okay, I want you to take in a big deep breath, get your pen in your pocket, you know, blow it all the way out, take in another deep breath, oops, beep. You know, you put something down because if the patient sees you ducking behind the portable, what do they think? This is bad, this thing is dangerous. I don't think I want this anymore, right? So, you know, if you need to, find a reason to duck. Patients can be pretty perceptive. You know, you go crouching down behind the portable. And maybe on a chest x-ray, that's not all that big a deal, but you're shooting a kVp on some of these people, right? You need to get out of the way, right? So, use your portable. It's a great source of portable lead radiation protection. All right, so the effects of kVp, you get more penetration, you get fewer interactions of all types. Compton's decrease, actually. Now, that's weird. The number is what we're talking about here. The overall number of Comptons decrease, and we get an increase in penetration, but the PEs decrease significantly more, okay? And how this works is, let's say, you create 100 X-ray photons at any kind of kVp. Let's say any kind of kVp. So you create 100 X-ray photons, and let's say one photon, well, let's say two photons penetrate through the patient, and you have, of the rest of them, half of those are photoelectrics and half of them are Compton. Okay, so you got two that penetrate, and then you got, what would that be, 48 that are photoelectrics and 48 that are Comptons. Let's say that's a 50 kVp. Now you increase your kVp to 100 kVp, and what you get is instead of those two penetration, you've got 20 that penetrate, okay? The Comptons, instead of being 48, you know, even if they were split even in half, that would be 40 and 40, but the Comptons are gonna go down, instead of being at 48, they may decrease to 44, okay? And what that means is your penetration is going to have to absorb, you know, or account for the rest of that, okay? So all of your interactions decrease, or I'm sorry, your photoelectrics. So all of your interactions, your true interactions decrease, penetration increases, but even though we get a decrease in Comptons, the decrease in penetration, or the decrease in photoelectrics occur at a much higher rate. So what's left in the remnant beam is a higher percentage, or the numbers decrease, but the percentage of the remnant beam is significantly higher with a higher kVp. Okay? I'm seeing a lot of blank stares, so let's put this on the floor. Can you give me some light over there? This is probably as far as we're going to go. All right. So we've got two X-ray beams, one at 50 kVp and one at 100 kVp. Okay. So at 50 kVp, we said we had two transmission, and that gave us 48 photoelectrics and 48 Comptons, right? So when we increase kVp, we increase penetration. right? So now we're gonna say that that 2 is now 20, okay? And Compton's decrease as kVp goes up, the overall number of Comptons in this case would decrease. So let's say that we're at 44. So what does that leave us for photoelectrics?
Well, more.
44, let's see, 48, would be 90, let's see, 60, so that'd be 64, so 36, right? Somebody check my math. 20, 64, 90, yeah. Okay? Right? Math is right?
What was the math
So,
you were doing?
huh?
Hold on, what was the math you were doing from?
If we created 100 photons, and we created 100 photons on this one as well. So at 50 kVp, we created 100 photons. At 100 kVp, we created 100 photons. Okay. So what do you know about kVp? As kVp increases, we get an increase in penetration, right? So these are the photons that penetrate through the patient without any kind of interaction, okay? So as we changed our kVp, we increased our kVp, did our penetration without any kind of interaction go up? Yes, okay. So I inverted these two, so let's just, so that we keep them straight across from each other. 36 photoelectric and 44 Compton. This is just kind of off the cuff here. So we've got 100 X-ray photons, 100 X-ray photons, 48 plus 48 plus 2, that'd be 16.
98.
All right, so we'll do that. 4 transmission. Doesn't affect anything, or we could have gone 99. But so 16 plus 4 is 20, so we got 4, 8, 100 photons, right? Everybody with me? Okay. So over here, we've got 4 plus 6 is 10. So we got 7, 8, 9, 100 photons, right? Everybody still with me? All right. So at 50 kVp, what else do we know about kVp? As kVp goes down, what increases? PEs, right. So as kVp goes up, PEs go down, right? So we get a decrease in photoelectric with higher kVp, we get an increase in photoelectric with lower kVp, right? Now, this is the part that's most confusing, is that we say that when kVp goes up, we get an increase in scattering, right? Okay, so here's the thing, it's true and false at the same time. The overall number of Compton scatter decreases as kVp goes up, but if what we're talking about is Compton to PE ratio, what is your ratio here?
1.
It's 1 to 1, right? So what is your ratio here? You have more of which? Compton, right. So photoelectric may be 1, but Compton may be 1 point, I don't know, 2, something like that, okay? So what that means is that your overall number of Comptons actually decrease, but in relationship to your photoelectric, it holds true that as kVp goes up, your Compton interactions dominate your image, okay?
So is penetration and absorption kind of like inversely?
Exactly,
Okay.
exactly. So penetration, in this case, you know, what penetration truly is both of these, you know. And again, some of the Compton may interact, but true Compton that penetrate through the patient, your and strike the image receptor, that's, both of them are penetration. But, just don't want you to be confused on that. But when we talk about penetration, these are the numbers we're talking about here.
Okay, so when it says, then why do we say that Compton's go up, it's because an increase in kVp will increase PEs, which decreases Compton, but your Compton interactions now dominate your image.
As you increase kVp, photoelectrics decrease, but they decrease at a higher rate. As kVp goes up, photoelectrics decrease, and Compton's decrease as well, but photoelectrics decrease at a higher rate than what Compton's. Okay? You got it? So both of them decrease, but kVp decreases significantly more than what Compton's doing. Okay? You good? That we're right on time.
I have a question.
Shoot.
So when you increase kVp, the patient dose increases, but earlier we talked about the photoelectric absorption, that increases their dose. So how does increasing kVp like increase the patient dose if they're not being absorbed as much?
Good question, good question. All right, so there too, we've got, perspective, okay? So as kVp increases, we increase penetration, we increase Compton scatter radiation, it seems like those should go down. But if the only thing that we're increasing is kVp, then it goes back to the Brim spectrum. Even if we shoot with 99 kVp, most of those photons are not 99 kVp, right? Most of them are where? 3, right. So most of those photons are going to be very low energy. So if the only thing that you increase is kVp, you're just hitting the patient with a significantly more. You're going to give them higher ones that they're more likely to penetrate, but most of what you're going to be hitting them with is very low energy, and so those are going to absorb. Okay, so it's not until you get to increasing kVp with a decrease in mass that you get an actual reduction in dose. Does that
So
help?
it's just because they're getting more of the lower dose
Yeah.
ones because it's only 1/3 of whatever.
Right,
Okay.
exactly, because most of your beam energy is at any kVp is very low. Okay? All right. Well, good luck on your Rad Bio test.